you recognize these headphones, chances are you know. You know they've been the industry standard for over 3 decades. But you also know there's nothing standard about them. Not when you know who uses them. Icons, masters, creators. You won't hear much talk about them because the sound speaks for itself. If you're a pro, you know.
Okay, there we go. A little feedback. Hey, everybody. Welcome, welcome. My name's Adam Weissler. I am a music correspondent and producer for the TV show Extra for the last 20 plus years, and a member of the Recording Academy. And I'm thrilled to be here at Sony to talk about 360 reality audio with this group. This is an amazing, amazing group of panelists here. Every one of them has amazing credits. I'm going to let them introduce themselves, but it's an honor to have them here, and I'm sure you guys have questions for them as well, so there'll be some time at the end for any questions. Any of you at home or watching virtually have some questions, I believe there's a chat function. You could add some questions. We'll try to get to as many of those as we can as well. So let's start with you. Brian, if you don't mind.
Okay. Hi. Oh, it works. I'm Brian Malouf. I have had a really happy career. I started out as a musician, and I switched to live sound, then I became a recording engineer. Then among the early class of engineers who were starting to be known as mixers, I was in that early class. Then I went into the record side of things, so I became the enemy for some and the champion for others, I'm sure. And then back to mixing, and now I teach at USC, and I do a lot of immersive mixing. So that was like a gift that I didn't really expect, but have really enjoyed getting into this immersive 360-degree mixing environment. That's me. This is my friend.
Thanks, Brian. My name's Frank Filipetti. Not much to say about me.
Oh, gosh. So much.
I started out of college to be a singer-songwriter for about 10 years. Nobody liked my songs, so I figured maybe I'll try something else, and started getting into engineering. And I started engineering in 1981, and I got the luckiest call one ever gets. After only engineering a year, I had the opportunity to work with Peter Asher on a project. From that point on, Peter Asher brought me in touch with so many people, and he brought me in touch with Foreigner, which gave me my first #1 hit, which was I Want to Know What Love Is, back in 1982. But it was just phenomenal to me that for 10 years I was trying to get songs to Peter Asher, and now I'm working with the guy, but in a totally different capacity. And in that capacity, I realized I was not a great songwriter, and but I did have an affinity for that, and I've been pursuing it ever since. I spent my whole career in New York, and currently now have a studio in Waterford, Connecticut called WTF Studios. It's not what you're thinking. It's Waterford Studios, WTF Studios. And I'm doing mostly now Atmos and 360 mixing. I've been doing that for about 4 years now, prior to COVID. And it's been survival for me because, you know, during COVID, the recording aspect really took a nosedive. But now that it's coming back, I have the very fortunate position to be only 3 miles from Power Station New England, which is an exact duplicate of Power Station New York. Anyway, I'm here to answer and talk about Sony 360, which I think is a game changer in the immersive world, and we'll get to that later.
Hi, my name's Ronald Prent. I am from Europe. I come from a little small country called the Netherlands. That's where I grew up. That's where I started my audio career at Weissler Studios. And then from there, after being there as an assistant, I got one of those calls that he got, but as an assistant to do a job with the police. And they came to record Senyata Modata. And I actually ended up recording 2 tracks on the album. So it was a big thing. And from there, you meet, like Frank says, you meet many people. They introduce you to other people. I started traveling. I spent a lot of time in Europe, in Germany. I ended up doing the first 3 Rammstein records and invent the Rammstein sound. I did a band called Guano Apes, similar, very heavy thrash metal. And I did a band called Manowar. It's an American band who's not very famous in its own country, but huge in Europe and in all the East countries. And went on going to Galaxy Studios in Belgium, then went back to my home ground, Weissler Studios, and rebuilt it 10 years ago and made it future-proof. And then Joey DeMaio of Manowar's, the band, who lives here in Auburn, upstate New York, in the Finger Lake district, which is a beautiful part of New York, bought a church and wanted to build a studio and called me up and said, well, you worked so 30 years for me, come and build me a studio, which I did 5 years ago. We moved over here with my wife and my son. And I'm still there, and it's called Valhalla Studios. And in my whole career, I was one of the first that started working in 5.1 for Sony and Philips when they invented the SACD format, and did all the experimental mixing for that. And since then, I never left immersive again. We did surround, then we did 9.1, and now we have immersive in 360, which I think, like Frank, is a game-changing format and makes headphones really interesting. Jimmy.
Hi, I'm Jimmy Douglas, world-class mixer. And so if we're talking about history, I guess when I was in high school, I got the fortunate ability to start working in a recording studio. And then along that path, when I started to kind of go to college, I wasn't very good at college, but I kind of did it anyway while I was making these records. And they said I'm pretty good at what I do, and I just kind of stayed with it. So I have, like, you know, records that go back as far as Aretha Franklin, hits with like Hall & Oates. I don't know. Then I moved forward, and Frank did Foreigner down the line, but I actually had their first 2 albums that I actually did the albums that broke them, Cold as Ice, and records like that. And then I moved on, and I did some jingles for a while just to keep, because, you know, I couldn't, there's nothing else I could do. Once I was doing this, what am I going to do? Take a regular job? Anyway, I ended up having the good fortune of running into a young producer named Timberland, and we made a lot of hits together. And then, of course, I worked with Jay-Z, and I worked with Justin Timberlake because of that. And now I'm sitting here. When the 5.1s thing happened, I was doing that, but it kind of went away. I was so sad, very sad. But now we're back, and we have immersive, and we have all of this right here. and it's bringing life and energy back to the craft. And I think that when you hear really good immersive, you understand why this is going to work. When you hear really bad immersive, you understand why you think, why are we wasting our time? But we're here to talk about the good stuff.
Yeah, and they're, even with all those credits, these guys are all being humbled. Some of you may know, but if you saw the list of all their credits and acclaims and awards, these are all pretty amazing chaps, so good to have you all here. And something else you guys all have in common is your implementation of this Sony 360 Reality Audio. If you can just talk about your first experience with this and how easy it was to implement.
Okay, so as you know, in immersive audio, both of the competing formats output two streams, a binaural stream for headphones and a stream for the physical outputs of a speaker system. So when I started out, I started off mixing in headphones, and then before I built my own studio for it, I would go to a place like the Sony studio in Culver City, or the Capitol Music Studios for Atmos, and listen to what I had done on speakers. And that is a way I think that everybody can easily start to experience this. The results can sound very similar, but the ways to get there are very different. If you guys have walked around to see the Walk Mix Creator, it's basically a plugin that goes on. I do it all on aux track. So I have my audio track and then an aux track with the Walk Mix Creator on it, so that it's getting all of the processing I do on the audio track and Pro Tools, and it processes the both the physical output and the headphones output after the fact as an export. So it's really quite ingenious and completely different than immersive and Dolby Atmos works, but again, the results are the same. The main difference, by the way, in the physical output is that the 360-degree physical output has a lower set of speakers, 2 or 3 or 4, however many you want, in front of you, that can be quite inventive once you figured out how to use those speakers.
I can't get used to my own voice. So let's talk about the 800-pound gorilla, which is Atmos. Atmos kind of started to become popular 2016, 2017. And today, it's definitely the dominant format. I started working in Atmos around that time and was initially excited about the possibilities because I was there with Jimmy and Ronald back in the DSD multi-channel audio days that Sony was promoting back in the aughts. And I was a lover of that format. Was sad to see it go away because once you've mixed in, multi-channel, you don't want to go back to stereo. It's pretty much that's the way it is. But the difference I found as I started getting into Atmos is that Atmos is a format that started out and to this day is a film mixing format. It's not a format for music, was never intended as a format for music. Now, why do I say that? Well, it's obvious when you go into a lot of Atmos rooms, one of the first things you'll see is like 3 big speakers in front, but then theater speakers on the side or theater speakers in the back. The whole idea of Atmos at the time was to work for a film. And when you look at the area that the Atmos audio encapsulates, you'll find that it's a rectangle, but that has a smaller top area and a longer base area. I don't know, there's no way to show it, but the bottom line is that your 5 or 7 speakers on the bottom, left, center, right, left side, left surround, right surround, they encapsulate a large rectangle. The top speakers encapsulate a much smaller rectangle. Why is that? Well, because in film, when you're sitting in a theater, you're 60 feet back from the screen, okay? You're not going to have a height speaker at the screen. There's no point to it, and you're never going to hear it that way. So at the screen, you have the 3 speakers in front, or 5, but then when you get to the first row of seating, that's when the height channels take over, okay? And you add height, so the top area circumnavigates a smaller area than the bottom area. Not only that, but the standard Atmos system is 712, not 714. A dichotomy which is very obvious when you go to any Atmos system, you'll find they're all 714 or 716, but for some reason, they've left it as a 712 that they get in the theaters. Once again, because the side channels aren't contributing real audio, it's contributing ambience and so forth. On the other hand, you now look at Sony 360. Sony 360 is not a rectangle on a small rectangle on a larger rectangle. It's a sphere. That's the way we hear. We hear spherically. And this system makes it much easier to place objects in where you want to hear them. There's no definition about the type of room that you're going to use. It's every room is possible. And so if you want to put something at the top, you put it at the top, you put it at the bottom, you put it up in the middle. There's no subwoofer, which for me is a kind of disadvantage, but apart from that, the actual sonic experience to me is much more immersive, because when I create a room as I'm mixing, I'm creating a room, not a room that has a big bottom and a small top. I'm creating a room that surrounds me. And that's why I love working in the 360 area. Not to take up too much time, but now what we are going to talk about today is not just the difference between Atmos and 360, but what I think is a game changer, which is called VME, which is the virtual mix environment, which you can see demonstrated there. In my 40 years of working in audio, or 45, has it been 45? 45 years of working in immersive audio, I have never heard a headphone experience that allowed me to hear front, back, sides, top, and bottom. I've heard simulations, I've heard spatial audio, I've heard, you know, the early binaural stuff, and they're all interesting, but you couldn't place things in various spots around. This is the first time I've ever heard it. This is the first time that I've ever put on a pair of headphones, and with my HRTF, and we'll get into what that is shortly, but I couldn't tell whether I was listening to speakers in a room or to headphones. It's that good. You hear front, back, center, sides, the whole deal. And for me, that's going to change everything, and we'll get into that later.
And Ronald, how much of a game changer was this for you? Because you're someone you've dealt with immersive audio, and you were experienced with this. When you got the Sony 360, how much of a change was that like for you the first time you implemented this?
Well, up until a couple years ago, it was kind of not the experience I hoped for, nor was Atmos, by the way. In Atmos, you mix in your room, or 360, you mix in your room, but then in reality, what 90% of the people hear is not that, but what they hear in headphones, the binaural experience. The Atmos binaural experience isn't bad, but it's not the same thing. Sure. It certainly isn't immersive. The 360 experience is not quite as good. I'm not happy. I'm not a shill for Sony or anybody. I'm talking to things because I love them. And when I don't love something, I'll also tell you that. The binaural experience in the Sony headphone is not great, but that doesn't matter now. Up until now, I've had to mix for the binaural because most of my artists are going to be listening that way. But now with this VME, I can now mix for 11 channels, and my artist is going to be able to hear exactly the same thing in their headphones.
Sure.
Not only my mix in the headphones, but hear it in my room, even if they're 2,000 miles away.
Yeah.
And that I find a game changer and fascinating, because that's been the difficult thing. We all work with artists that don't necessarily sit next to us anymore, but they want to hear what we've done, and when you send it to them, they're listening in stereo to binaural. They're not hearing what we're hearing. So this allows, you know, changes that whole game.
Gotcha. That's not it.
Yeah.
Yeah, Ronald, just curious your experience with this as well, as someone who was already experiencing immersive audio, just what the game changer was for you and your artists, and how much the artists appreciated that.
Well, before the VMA, before this last development, we're working with binaural, and for Sony, we did a couple of reissues of Sondheim musicals. And they would let us go back to the original multi-tracks. So it would be 8-track or 16-track analog or 24-track analog sometimes. And it was a great challenge because it's theater. And you mix that on speakers. And in the theater, some of the productions of the Sondheim musicals, characters actually walk around. Characters go on a higher elevation. Shots are fired from there, so ideal for immersive. And then at that point we were already experimenting with other HRTF profiles, so the hearing for your own ears. And I was using that and it worked pretty well. But then I started to go back to the general hearing profile, what other people will hear when they go online, because to me that's more important than my own. My own's good for checking. And anyway, to cut a long story short, it's a long process to mix these musicals. It took months because there are original producers involved and the state of Sondheim was involved. And they couldn't come. Now how do you do that? So we took the headphone output, the binaural output of the 360, and I streamed that to the two clients, the producers. And they would sit there a whole day with their headphones on. And first they didn't really hear, well, what's the big difference? So I streamed them the stereo mix, because I do a stereo mix at the same time. Stream them the stereo mix. Then stream them the same 5 minutes in binaural. And then they went, whoa. Because then they would actually hear characters go behind their heads. Or like you have the bottom layer, which is fantastic in musicals. And that was, for me, a thing there where what I do on speakers, I can get very close to on a headphone and not have to figure out why it sounds different and have to adapt for the headphone, but then it doesn't work on speakers. And when mixing in the Sony 360 format with the walk mix and using the measurements of my room, I could put the headphone on, like Frank said, you can put the headphone on. And at some point, and Gus did it for me, he said, put the headphones on, and I said, I have them on, so you can turn the speakers off. He said, the speakers are not on. And I took my headphones off, and it was quiet. And I put them back on, and it sounded like I was listening in my room to my speakers, what I've mixed. And that was not even with the latest version that you have heard. I haven't heard that yet, but that was already more than close enough for me to be convincing, going, okay, this I can do, and I can share this with a client, and have a really emotional, exciting experience, and not just with musicals. I do it with music now too, and it's the same. And I have a lot of clients that are still in Europe, and it's the only way I can do it with them. And every time I send them the binaural, they sit there and they text me on WhatsApp, whoa, can you change this? And I make it go somewhere else, and they go, yeah, I love it when it comes from there up there. And so it's a very exciting time for us as mixers that we can get these tools. And what's your experience with that?
And just how the artists responded to this as well. These amazing artists you've worked with, just how they embraced this technology. And you've always been at the forefront of stuff, and just what that was like to see how the excitement of the artists when they came into a room with you and they were going to use this technology.
Well, I was going to say that.
Please.
For me, it's been a long learning curve down the road, because what I did was I did the exact opposite of what you did with the headphones first. I put speakers up and I started mixing to the speakers, and I think I did a great job. In fact, I know I did, because when the artists came through, Timberland and Justin, and then when they came through, they were freaked out. However, as 98% of the people in the world are going to experience, it's really about the buds. They're never going to hear what I heard. Well, not yet, but I'm saying, but in the process, I had to suddenly take that into account. And there's a mastering engineer that came over my place, and he goes, "This is amazing to me, but who's going to hear this?" And I was like, "Stop being a naysayer." He said, "I'm just telling you something." And sure enough, when I started listening in headphones, it wasn't sounding like it sounded up there. So I had to actually go backwards and figure out, why don't you start in the headphones first, and then when you bounce back and forth, you can spread it out. It's almost like, you remember back in the days when we had stereo? No, but when we used to mix on like little oratones or something, and then it's like, kind of like, if you got it right there, when you put it up here, it's going to be even better. When you try it the other way, as a matter of fact, speaking of when I was a kid, same thing. I started mixing on the big speakers, and every time the shit would not be right when I handed it in. I'm like, but it sounded great when I was doing it. So it's kind of the same theory, really, where you work with the I call them even the earbuds, because I do that sometimes, because most people have earbuds, they don't have headphones. And I would say about the Sony, and I'm going to tell you the difference from my experience, besides the fact that you're talking about Gus with the, what is it, the VME, whatever they call that thing. I am definitely a hater of stuff. I don't believe in most of this stuff, but he did that same thing, put it in my ears, and then went both ways, and I said, "Sounds like the room," and he was like, "No, that's the headphones," and I'm like, "Get out of here." It really did sound like the room. I was like, I am definitely sold. One of the things I do like very much about the Sony is, like, it feels continuous. Everything feels continuous around you. When I'm doing Atmos sometimes, I'm not here to compare them, I'm just saying this is an experience. I find that as I'm panning stuff and putting stuff, I can almost feel a spot where it falls off the planet. Almost like the rectangle you were describing. It's kind of definite, and you can kind of go, oh, it stops right there, and it starts right there. Sony has the opposite problem. It doesn't stop or start anywhere. You have to really control this thing. That's my experience anyway.
And then, just passing it down, if we can start over in this again. But just Brian, just the excitement of doing this. You guys have been doing this for decades, and to still have the desire to be at the forefront of something, and to, one, I don't know, it's probably a necessity in some ways, but you guys have such obvious excitement for this technology. Just how has it changed what you do in terms of your optimism about the future, about recording, about being on the forefront of things, and how has that affected the artists and producers you work with?
There's two camps. You know, there's a camp of people that want things to stay the same, and there's a camp of people that want to push things forward. This, to me, was at first skepticism on my part. I was one of those guys that said, "Oh, I got 2 ears, I need 2 speakers." I really was, until I heard it. And then and like all of the artists that have come through my studio, once you hear it, you go, "Holy shit, this is a wonderful way to experience music." So that idea, for me, who's spent my whole life in a room almost by myself, sometimes with Richard, was the most exciting. I write these little newsletters, and it's like I say, this is the most exciting place my ears have been in a very long time. And the idea of the public accepting this is like, as far as I can tell, the public is hearing this immersive format whether they know it or not. And my idea, Jimmy, is always to at least get the headphones to represent an excellent version of the original stereo mix. and then expand and listen, okay, now let's see what we can do, and really have a nice experience for most of the people, like you say, who are hearing things on headphones. The 360 thing does an incredible job, especially with sparse music. In other words, if it's not a lot of heavy guitars or a lot of dense instrumentation, of really being able to hear the parts from all around you. And that's, we're moving the needle forward, right? We're giving people a new experience that is not a tremendous departure from what they're used to. So it's super exciting to me to bring us into a new era.
And the beauty is, when you say public and headphones, anyone can listen to this on their headphones.
And they are.
Yeah. You don't need special setups necessarily to take full advantage of everything you guys are creating. Right.
You do need measurements. You do need the HRTF, which we can talk about a bit. HRTF is just a medical term which determines the geometry of the inside of your ear. Everybody's geometry is different. Every ear canal has different bumps and ridges and so forth. So we're all different. And so when you listen with a pair of headphones, the reason why some people like headphone X and some people prefer headphone Y is because with their geometry, it just works better. Some headphones I'll put on and say, Jesus, these are too bright. And other headphones I'll put on and say, where's the top end? Other people will be reversed. And that's because we all have different geometries in there. It's only been recently that we're really taking that into effect now, so that if you put your own HRTF into that headphone, you now get something based on your geometry. And that makes it so much easier to hear things like spatial cues, what's in front of you, what's behind you, what's up, what's down. A generic geometry doesn't give you that. So with this new system now, that's plugged in, that's part of it. But you have to have your ears tested. You have to get your own HRTF. The beauty of this is with your own HRTF, and then if you measure your own room, you can give that to anybody, and most importantly, your artist. As Ronald was saying, he works with artists in Europe. They're not going to come to his room here in the States. In the past, you'd send them your immersive mix, but what they'd be listening to is the binaural. I'm sorry, I could care less about the binaural, other than the fact that a lot of people are going to hear it, so I make sure that it's good. But you know, a lot of companies that I work with, they'll actually A/B the binaural and the original CD, and if it doesn't sound exactly the same, then they'll reject it, paying no attention at all to what the immersive mix is. So what I try to do is get them as close as I can, but I'm still paying attention to the 360. Now with this system, I can tell James Taylor or Carly Simon, or I was going to say George Michael, but he's dead now. You know, these people that I've worked with in the past, and I can tell them, okay, use your HRTF, use my room, and now listen to it. And now they aren't hearing some binaural. They're actually hearing my mix in my room. And now for the first time, I can say, what do you think? And know that I'm not going to get back something that says, well, in the original CD, there was, you know, the guitar was slightly right center, and you've got it. This time, it's an experience, and that's why I call it a game changer, because not only now can you give this to your artist, but if I'm here at this show and I've got to do a mix tonight, I can mix in my room with my headphone and actually do some really great work, because I'm kind of in my room. So this whole thing changes everything.
Amazing, yeah. And if we could switch gears a little bit, just talk about in terms of catalogs and what this means in terms of at music that's already out there and applying this? And have you guys had experience with that, what that means for great albums in the past who have a new life now due to this technology?
Not everything's better in immersive, but because some things need to be left where they once were, that's their life. But still, there's if you do have to do some of the old stuff, you're not obliged to use all channels. I just did a mix where it is an immersive mix, but 80% of the time everything happens in the left, center, right, and sometimes a little bit up front, and only in one particular place in the song where it allows it for the arrangement of the song to happen, it becomes really big, and the rest stays where it was. Because if you take it apart, it changes the feel of the song so much, and some of the older stuff that we know is sounding great and played great in stereo, but then you put the guitar a little bit further to the left and oh, it's rushing, or you put the bass somewhere else, oh, it's a bit late, and those are things you don't want to hear. But if you then with today's technology start correcting that, which you can, then the whole song goes away, the magic from the song goes away. And I think that's one of the things that we have to be very aware of when we mix in this format. It can give us great things and great new things and new emotions, but it can also sometimes destroy a song if you don't make the correct decisions. And that's a really great place to be, actually. I find it very positive.
And Jimmy, let me ask you, in terms of artists you work with, just how their headspace has changed, their creative thing, since this technology exists. How in the writing process, when you work with an artist, just from the forefront, the opposite of catalog, things have changed now in terms of artists even can conceive music and conceive what could be done in the studio. That must be exciting.
So I think that for the artist and the new stuff that's being made, I don't think, listen, the source is still the source. And let's not mistake that and let's not forget that. So they're looking for if you're looking for some earth-shattering type of change, it's not. You still got to write a good song and you still have to have some sort of stuff laid out. Everybody's experimenting with how can we make it different noticeably, or how can you make a difference in a record where it stands out and does something crazy. Maybe I pan the strings on something. Actually, I made an executive decision. I was talking about a classic. The record should mirror what the original record was. Understand one thing. If you've made a hit and anybody's heard it, there's a certain construction to that particular hit. There's a certain way the vocal sits on top of this and the guitar sits there, certain amount of reverb, certain amount of space. And half of those records that we made, we spent all of our time trying to pack them into 2 speakers. And in doing so, there's a lot of chewing gum in there that you're not going to hear because there's 40, 50 tracks, and you got all kinds of crap in between that's just a little filler. Now, here comes us, and we're breaking it apart. Guess what? Does not sound like you were saying. Doesn't sound the same at all. And all that energy we went into mixing that other record, it's like you're mixing it again. But however, it was created in a market to fit those 2 speakers. So it's a whole different vibe. And every artist I talk about, they go, oh, we have Atmos now. We have immersive now. I can't wait to whatever. But yet, they don't write anything that really makes a difference to it yet that I've found out. There's a guy named Tom Dowd, who we might know. I call him the godfather of audio. And I grew up in the Atlantic Studios, and he'd say, there's only left, right, left, center, and right. In between, you don't do anything. So for all the years, I had this theory, that's how I'm mixing. I'm either the left, hard right, or in the center. I wasn't piddling around with hey, put the vocal here, I wasn't doing all that. And then one day, it dawned on me, he made a homemade board at Atlantic where he had a pan pot that only went left, center, and right. And I was like, he said that because he just didn't feel like building a continuous pan pot. The point of the story is we are now in a continuous mode in terms of in front of us and behind us, and it feels a lot different than 5.1, which I've done a lot of that. The surround, it's great. But now you have this and you have that. and you have all this other depth. And I think that, for me, I keep telling everybody, look, let's make the good records that we know how to make, and eventually somebody's going to stumble on to figuring out how this new technology adapts to the new music they're making. I don't think it's hip-hop worthy. Hip-hop itself is always usually samples of 2 tracks. How are you going to break that out? It lost the whole nut when you do that. So to me, it's a work in progress.
All that said,
I gotta just want to add something, is that Jimmy or someone or Ronald was saying not all good immersive sounds good. In fact, there's an awful lot of shit out there. And the reason that there's an awful lot of shit out there is the commitment by the record company to the artist. And some record companies, and especially in the Atmos world, they're allowing young people who have no experience in immersive mixing but don't charge a lot of money to take these classics and mix one song at a time. Now, I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I think for anything new, give all the young people all the time they can and let them experiment to whatever they want. But the folks that I've been working with at Sony have a different commitment. If we're doing a classic album, and I'm working with Korn right now, they've gotten in touch not only with me, who made the album, but also Michael Beinhorn, who was a producer. The people who were involved in the making of that record are involved in the mixing of and repurposing that into immersive. Does it cost them more money? You bet it does. But the difference is that, as you were saying, you know, when you bring it out, maybe a guitar has to be pushed a little forward or backward because now spread out, it makes a difference. Someone young and new and inexperienced doesn't have the experience with the artist in that song to make that decision. So they either do it all fix everything, or they don't fix anything. But if you made that album, if you were there while we were putting it together, you know, yeah, that shouldn't do that. Let's get that, let's take, and the point is, I really applaud Sony's desire to reach out to the original people who have made these albums and bring them. That shows me the commitment to music, as opposed to, let's just put a bunch of stuff out there because people want to hear this on Apple Music and spatial audio. And this is very critical. You've got a company that's saying, let's do it right, may cost more, but in the end, we don't have as much shit out there, and we don't have to suffer through a lot of stuff.
And Brian, when it's simply in the hands of someone as experienced as you, and to have this new technology in your toolbox, and you know when to use it, when not to, how easy was it to make that transition, and when do you know it's going to work and when it's not? That's something you, from experience, you know this is going to enhance some of your recordings.
I don't think it's particularly easy, for all the reasons that Jimmy was saying. Sure. It's you got to be tasteful, and the experience helps. I know a lot of what we're doing now in immersive is an emerging technology, so it's kind of a moving target, and it's going to keep evolving. So you have to stay on top of the technical aspects of it, and you have to continue to use the really important technology in the room, which is between your ears. You've got to think right. You've got to represent music. I, like everybody else, have heard really good immersive mixes and really bad ones. That I don't know if it's mostly bad, but I've heard both, and that is in the hands of the engineer. And I don't discount new approaches from young people who didn't experience analog the way we did. It didn't experience stereo in the same way we did. There's some really good guys that are young, and when it comes to catalog especially, it is a great advantage, I think, for me to I know what I did back then. And I know the equipment that was being used, not only by me, but by everybody in that era. And I know how missing a stereo bus processing element can work against you in immersive, and I figured out ways to make that up. So it's not that it's easy, but it is like a really good thing. What? Well, the main thing that you have to do to recreate a stereo bus compression, for instance, EQ is rather easy, but if you make a key track that is made up of the elements of all the stems, and let that key track control a compressor on every track, then you kind of start to approach the kind of bus compression that you're hearing in stereo mixing. And as you guys know, in Pro Tools, there is the ability to control every processor on a instantiation point, an insert point, with just one set of controls, and that's kind of the way you do it.
Just for fun, I'm curious, which of your artists over the years were the most willing to embrace new technology and new formats like this? Was there one artist that always came to you and wanted what was the newest, what was at the most forefront compared to some others? Or any names you can drop in terms of like, I need to do what's new, I want to try this, let's give it a shot?
For me, it was Kenny Loggins. That guy was like fearless and wanted everything new and everything old at the same time. Should I go down this way with that?
When you're dealing with different types of music and you're doing an Atmos or 360 mix, the first thing you're going to find out is some music works good, some music doesn't. As Ronald was saying, I have some George Michael mixes that I ended up doing, and I love the way they sound. I have Carly Simon, I've been doing some catalog, James Taylor, all that. Those things sound terrific. Steely Dan, I'm waiting for Elliot Shiner to do some Steely Dan. Those things sound amazing in surround. On the other hand, I've just started working on the Korn Untouchables album. That is a bitch. I'm telling you right now, because of the way in stereo, the way that we brought those guitars and the elements and the drums and the guitars and the bass, they were a fixture, they were a unit. And when you start spreading that stuff out, and it's very low-end heavy and filled with distortion, to move that into the room so that it doesn't sound like it's all coming from in front, that's been the hardest thing for me to deal with. And you really have to look at it in a new way, because it's not just put this guitar, you know, Monkey's guitar here and Head's guitar here and throw some reverb. This is now a really intense process. So I've just started on this, but I can guarantee you I'm going to spend a few more sleepless nights putting it together. But it's also illustrative, you know. I think once it's done, it's going to sound terrific. But until then, it's going to be a struggle.
Again, because I have a lot of European clients,
Sure.
I have to admit that none of them have asked for it, because it's not so big in Europe yet. And if you suggest to do stuff, then they go, yeah, but, and then budget becomes a real big issue, because they won't want to pay for it. And it's really hard sometimes to convince somebody. So what I sometimes do is I do the stereo mix for them, or a single or an album, and I just do an immersive mix on the side. Now, because I work partly analog, partly digital, I have a console that does 11.1, and I can send objects, and I have a different way of doing things backwards to most people, but it allows me to still mix an immersive discrete, and then translate that to Sony 360 or Dolby Atmos, and then finish that off in that vein. So I can then throw them a track, spend time in my own time mixing one track and immersive and send it, and then they sometimes want it, sometimes they would have to pay for it, but then they can't get it released. There is another one of the major labels. So I'm in a different position in that sense, that our albums that I would die to remix. I would love to do the first two Rammstein albums in Sony 360. But they're at Universal and partly owned by the band themselves, and there is not consensus about what to do with that. And so, but it can go either way. In Hamburg is a big movement of women audio, women producers, women engineers, and they asked us to do Atmos versions of their mixes because they wanted to release it, and they did it themselves. They paid for it themselves. They get funding through crowdfunding. So that's a whole different world than over here.
Sure.
I'm curious, though, real quick, Ronald.
I just want to say
Yeah.
one thing, because I want to give the haters on Instagram who love to hate me something. Look, Europe is Europe, okay? They do great vintage stuff, but the US and Japan are always looking to the future. All right, so now get on and tell me what an asshole I am.
But that's why I'm here.
That is real quick, Ronald. I'm just curious what the two police tracks you worked on, you actually recorded yourself for.
So, say that
The
again?
two police tracks you mentioned earlier, you actually recorded 2 songs yourself, you mentioned?
For Sony?
You worked on Zinjana Mandata, correct?
Oh, I did John Dada.
Yeah, you mentioned you recorded a few songs yourself.
Behind My Camel and To Do Dada.
Very good, all right.
And To Do Dada, it's only called To Do Dada because when we cut the track, that was what he's saying in the chorus. He had no lyrics. And this was the time when everything happened in studios. They were recording in Studio 1 in Weissler, big setup, day after day after day. And this thing comes in and says, I just wrote this song. I want to quickly record it. But they don't want to change the setup of Studio 1. So Studio 2 was empty. We set up another drum kit. I grabbed the same microphones that they were using. And in half a day, we recorded To Do Da Da. And that was all the lyrics he had. And they kept it.
Love it. Had to ask you that. And Jimmy? In terms of the artist, yeah.
I'd like to say another thing. You know, we're all professionals up here. We're supposed to be, and we're supposed to know stuff, right? But I've always done all this stuff from the hip. I've just always been shooting from the hip. I have very little knowledge about. I could know more, but I've been busy making records to figure it out. You know, when you're doing shit and it sounded good, you tuck it and you go home. I'm only saying that to say that some of the records that I redo, there were no stems, there were no anythings, there's no records of even what I did on the board. And even me, who made the record that I made, I should have all the knowledge of what I did. I find it hard to match myself. And I do have the knowledge. There was one Justin Timberlake record I did where I did it by myself. There's no notes, and I'm like, okay, there's no notes, there's no stems, but I know how Jimmy thinks. But Jimmy didn't have the console that he had. And actually, so Jimmy couldn't really just mix like Jimmy mixed it when he did that. And I'm just saying that to say that with proper knowledge, theoretically, I should be able to sonically figure it out. But I dare to say that most of the records that I know that I've made, I don't know about you guys, but it's like I wasn't physically figuring anything out. I was just getting from A to B, and there was the stereo mix, and let's go home, okay? So I'm only saying that to say, when you put records like the older records we're talking about in the hands of people that have done a lot of studying about sound and so forth, it's like, they're not going to get that. There's a group I produced and I engineered called Slave, and I happened to get a hold of their record to do an Atmos. And I got to tell you guys, I am not kidding. I'm going to make this confession in front of you guys. I could not make that snare sound like I made a snare then. I spent a day, and it's like, without that console and without my mind being in that place at that time, I mean, I did the shit out of it back then. I did. I'm like, thank you very much. But I'm not getting that sound now, and no matter what I do, all the little tricks and all the toys we got, it ain't sounding the same. So I don't know why I'm saying that. I'm just saying, like, this is not an easy thing to do. So what I believe is, as we're learning about this, and when you talk about, you know, the newer people coming into it, they're going to show us what this technology is supposed to be. They may not be able to duplicate what we had done in the past, and I get that, but I'm excited to see what people are going to come up with and show me. It's like, this is what this is for. Thank you.
Well said, well said. Yeah, I'm about to get to that right now. So, love to get some questions from you guys. If any questions for any specific. Yeah, we'll start with you.
I just want to know how much of a consideration is the mix process before you even record? Like when you go in the studio, you go, I want to mix it this way. Do you take that into consideration while you're recording?
I do. Every minute of every performance, I'm trying to visualize how it's going to sound when I go to mix it. Every note.
I'd say since 5.1, I think everything I do, even when 5.1 died, everything I've done since certainly the early aughts has been with the idea of doing an immersive at some point in time.
Yeah, me too. It's always in the back of your mind when you start a tracking. You put microphones out that you think, okay, when I'm going to mix it, I can do this with it, I can do that with it, or even with vocals. I just did an experimental vocal recording, not here, but in Switzerland, with 10 microphones in speaker placements, to see what we could do with it in mixing. And in the end, I only used the 2 left and right microphones for the vocal.
There's this thing called phase that's constantly screwing us up.
Exactly, but I have clients also that want to hear that. They want to experiment with these things. And it's good because you have more opportunities when you can do it in 360, but you can also make a lot of more mistakes in the timing of the audio, in the phase relationship.
I have a question for us. So you mentioned the word phase, and that's one of the things growing up. People would always say it, but I just never cared. I never flipped the bottom and top snare mic. I never did unless I just couldn't hear it. But I'm only asking that because, once again, I'm not paying attention to phase. And now that I have all this space, the phase shouldn't be as important because now the sources are further away from each other. Yes, I'm asking. I'm not telling. Any thoughts about that?
That's true, but on the other hand, that's why, even though I bemoan the fact that I have to mix in binaural, I always check, because phase something that you don't notice, let's say between the left top and the right rear, you're not going to notice a real phase issue in the room, but you will notice it if suddenly the level drops 3 dB in the binaural. So it's always a good idea to check that as you're go back and forth between the stereo and the binaural because phase is, I can't think of anything really that's more important in getting the phase of all your elements right, and especially your speakers, because many times I've gone into rooms and played my stuff back and the sub is gone, and I'll say, what's going on? Well, the sub is 180 degrees out from the main speakers, so these are very important items to check, and stereo will help you do that.
I'm curious if there's any more questions out here from anyone else. Any questions? Gentlemen, yeah. All right, go ahead.
Oh, no. No. Not me. Do you use correction software at the output for your headphone mixing? No.
Well,
Question was about correction software.
VME, yes. That, in a sense, that's correction software, in the fact that you put your HRTF. By the way, that's not scientific gobbledygook or bullshit. I thought, to be honest with you, I'm like like Jimmy was saying, skeptical about all this stuff. And I got to tell you, when I heard the difference of different HRTFs in my headphones, not just slightly different, massively different, which only goes to show how different our ears are, all of us. So this is important. But yeah, that's the only correction I would use, yeah.
Okay, any more questions or any questions virtually that anyone has? I don't believe so. Okay, we're going to wrap this up, but really exciting, guys. Also, all of you here, we talked about ear measurements. Everyone here could experience those ear measurements right here in this booth. So make sure you take advantage of that, because it's amazing technology you're going to want to experience. It should be a lot of fun.
Not only because it's going to help each and every one of you. But also, the more measurements we get, the more this software becomes applicable across the general population.
And it's just a lot of fun. You'll listen to things differently. I enjoyed that experience. So, guys, you're all amazing. Thanks for spending the time talking about this technology. You're all the best at what you do, and I'm sure everyone really enjoyed listening to what you had to say. So thank you all very much. And thank you guys all for joining in.